Okay, let's do a video on biodiversity and its connections. We're going to talk about the bigger picture here and how genes and species and ecosystems all interact with one another and their abiotic factors part of that ecosystem and how that governs the diversity of ecosystems. So what is biodiversity? Let's just break it down. Bio, as you know, already means life, and a synonym for diversity is variety. So we're really talking about the variety of life. Now, more specifically, if you're going to give a better definition of biodiversity, we should be talking about the diversity or the variety of life in a specific area. And you got to make sure that you understand that this diversity, this biodiversity, isn't just the different types of species in that area. It's also the variety that exists within that species. So what I'm saying is, if there's a plot of land, I'll just consider this Downers Grove, and we have some organisms, make them circles, and they're dispersed all throughout the environment. And some of these might have frowny faces, and some of these, permanent, by the way, permanent frowny faces, or smiley faces, right? So there's variety within the species, but then there's also going to be other organisms that exist in this population as well, right? So there's diversity both within the species and diversity including all different types of species, squares and triangles, and this includes plants and animals and fungi and bacteria. That's the biodiversity of the area. Now, we tend to think just at how these organisms look to govern their diversity. So we're basically talking about the phenotype here, right? The behaviors maybe they exhibit, how they look. But remember that these phenotypes are governed by the genotypes, right? Genotypes meaning the DNA that exists within these organisms, right? The commonality of life with DNA inside those cells. And it's all about taking that DNA, those nitrogen-based differences, transcribing them and translating them into proteins, and those proteins are the phenotype. So we're talking about the diversity in a big, big picture, but also in a small picture as well. Right, so don't forget to look at that molecular basis. All right, so if you Google biodiversity, you get an image like this. This is a typical type of picture that you'd see maybe for a coral reef. And I don't know the different types of fish here necessarily. I understand some basics, but we've got this yellow fish that you can clearly see has variety within the species. Some of them, they have, I think it kind of looks like a little purple line here and a purple eye. Maybe their lines of some of them is a little bit longer, a little bit thicker than others. Maybe the caudal tail, right, is maybe a little bit more forked than others. This variety exists as a biodiversity piece for that species in that coral reef. But then you also look and we've got this bigger fish, maybe a snapper or a grouper hiding out there waiting for some prey to swim by. And the fact that there's two different species now increases the biodiversity. You also have corals, which are a relative of the jellyfish in that category. I don't know if you knew that or not. And you've got things like algae that are existing on the surfaces of these organisms. We've got what you might call seaweed that exists in here as well. This is a typical coral reef, sea anemones and whatnot, that has lots of diversity. Right? There's diversity within the species, and then there's diversity between different species. You're going to find most of these coral reefs along the equatorial regions of the planet. Another image that pops up when you look at biodiversity is something like this. Now there's tons of different organisms in this picture. Do they all exist in the same environment? No. They all exist on the planet, but the idea is that you gotta make sure you don't think just animals, right? We're including plants, we're including bacteria, we're including fungus, right? So we've got a luna moth, and we've got a tortoise, and we've got some bergamots, flowers, right? There's all kinds of different things, all the way down to the very small, teeny tiny water bear, which we'll talk more about, and jellyfish. And the diversity includes all these different types of organisms. All right, so when you look up some things on a specific publication is Nature. They're a good publication magazine for understanding more about living organisms. You look up and you find the species that are currently described in journals, how many there are per grouping here. So we're looking at bacterium, blue-green algae, 4,760. We've got the bryophytes, or the mosses, and the conifers, which are things like spruces and pine trees, things of that nature. And then you've got the angiosperms, where we're going to focus most of our studies, specifically the sedges and carex. And you've got 250,000 different species currently described, and that number varies depending on if somebody has a subspecies and they're considering that a separate species and whatnot. And then you get down here, and finally we start looking at some of the diversity in the animal kingdom. So this number breakdown is favoring animals because there's clearly showing more groupings or classes. You got amphibians and fishes and starfish, which are not truly fish, and then you got the invertebrates, right? So invertebrates all the way down, and then within here you've got the arthropods, so that includes insects and crustacea and things of that nature. But clearly see that based on this research piece here, we've got 1.4 million different species described. Now, that range varies depending on what publications you look at and what scientists are talking about. Some scientists say that possibly 5 million different species exist on the planet right now. Now, that's nothing compared to the billion to 4 billion that are extinct from this planet and gone forever due to natural forces, or sometimes not so natural, right? Destruction by humans, things like passenger pigeon and dodo birds and whatnot got their demise not from natural events, but actually from humans. We'll talk some more about that. All right, so what increases or decreases biodiversity? Well, in order for there to be diversity in the life of the area that you're looking at, there clearly has to be a sustainable population. So most of the sustainable population comes from one major source. It's the sun, right? Sun provides the energy for the planet. So the degrees of sun exposure to these different areas is really going to govern the biodiversity. Now, there can be chain reactions of things. You got areas that might not get sun at all, right? Sunlight exposure, but because it's adjacent to another ecosystem, you get kind of a drip down effect or a roll down effect. If you talk about like the very deep, dark places of the ocean, they don't get sunlight, but you end up getting this, I think they call it biotic snow, that rains down from the upper levels, the upper trophic levels, the top levels. If we're talking ocean up here, we've got this photic zone, which is the top layer where the sunlight can get through and into. But then past that photic zone, there's not a whole lot of light that gets down here, and you get down to the bottom. As these things die and decompose, they all float down, and that's where you get bottom feeders will consume that stuff, or the decaying organisms that fall down. And all that stuff came, that energy source came from the sun, right? We got that power of 10%. So as you're talking food pyramid wise, passing from one level to the next, you only get 10% of that energy as you move up the trophic levels. Right? So what increases or decreases? Part of it's the abiotic factors, right? Things like sun. But then another part has to do with the symbiotic relationships that we talked about. Commensalism, predation, parasitism. The predator-prey model governs a lot of how many different types of organisms can possibly be in an area. Disrupt this symbiotic relationships that exist in that natural environment, and you're really going to throw the diversity of that environment into a tailspin. One great example we've kind of talked about already in class is the example at Yellowstone. Right? Yellowstone National Park has a very wide area that includes organisms that are grazers, like the elk, big, huge, basically deer. And these elk consume, they're herbivores, so they consume plants that are in full bloom with reproductive parts exposed, like flowers that you're normally used to, and areas that are more herbaceous and they haven't exposed. So they're grazing on all this kind of stuff. But what happened is humans kind of wiped out the wolf population that is in that area. And without wolves, then the elk population increased, decreased the population of all kinds of different plants. And until more recently, when we reintroduced this wolf and that elk population came down, and then we started seeing the plant population start going up again, the different flowers, the diversity was very, very low until the wolves got reintroduced. So we consider that a keystone species, right? So all these terms and things that we've talked about with our ecology unit kind of come back and we work through this biodiversity component. All right, so how is this related to evolution? Changes in population over time. That's a loose definition of evolution, right? So if we have a tree, we have all kinds of different organisms on this tree. We have A, B, break this up, C, D, and E. They all share a common ancestor way back here, right? So the diversity of maybe a trait, maybe it's 5 fingers, that diversity of trait might be shared across all these current or extant organisms, right? The ones that are not extinct. Maybe there's some branches here that have perished and aren't up here at current time. But you can say that all these 5 that have that common trait, there's not a ton of diversity necessarily in the fact that there's 5 digits, but it all probably came back from this ancestor. Now A and B, since they're closer on this tree, probably share more similar traits than it does with D. But D and E might share more common traits. So the diversity that you see within species and between species also relates to their evolutionary history, right? Maybe their dispersal, maybe their interbreeding, maybe the natural selection that is exhibited before. And that's some of the questions that scientists are trying to answer. Is some of the diversity due to dispersal, or is it due to evolutionary problems, natural selection pieces? This is a publication that showed up in NCBI when I was hunting for things, which we will be working with NCBI more. NCBI is a database that has all your DNA and RNA and protein coding that was from scientists that published. So you'll have all this stuff. This is free information. You're going to be working through these as we continue not only this unit that we're working on and this research that we're working on, but also into other units that we continue on through the year. So this publication you can kind of see talking about biodiversity and its change or its adaptability, its ability to sustain maybe high levels of biodiversity or low levels as the planet changes, right? So regulations of the climate and soil and nutrient cycles, all that stuff, freshwater production, is all linked to biodiversity. So when you start thinking, well, what does biodiversity mean to me? You have to really take a step back and realize that it's not just about maybe saving one frog species. It's about preserving nature, not only for nature's sake, but also because it's important for us and our survivability. So this is an infographic that was taken from Nature, right? That publication that I told you about earlier. And it's a nice infographic showing the threats that we're seeing with biodiversity, right? Biodiversity threats. You can see in more areas that humans hang out, and we don't have a lot of data in these areas. It doesn't mean that there's no threat there. It just means that there's not a whole lot of data that can be gathered. We're talking about areas that might be harder to get into. But anyway, these areas that we see human threat are also severe areas for water consumption, clean water supplies. So this biodiversity connection connected to our ability to get fresh water is a huge concern. Some other things that we as humans need to think about biodiversity for our own preservance, right? Our ability to continue on. Think about it from the farming perspective. If we don't have diverse ecosystems, we don't have diverse microorganisms that can help convert nitrogenous waste into things that other plants need. It wouldn't be able to turn nitrogen gas into useful compounds. We get that from certain types of soil bacteria. Those nitrogen compounds are vital for making amino acids. Right? So we need that biodiversity in the soil to help out with plants. We also need healthy plants and diversity of plants, rooted perennials, ones that keep coming back year to year, to help keep the soil intact, and so that we end up getting water retention in the soil to actually allow those plants to grow. Water cycling, we need to be able to keep nutrient cycling going with these plants. And then here's a big one. I don't know about you, but I'm a huge fruit consumer, right? Pollination is a big part of producing fruits, because if you don't know it, if we have a generic flower here, I'm just going to throw some petals on it. Right, the flower may be sitting on the stalk like this. This bottom middle piece here, the female parts will enlarge and start turning into a fruit. That's the ovary. When that thing enlarges, the seeds are on the inside. This is basically a sac that has the babies in it. This sac generally is upside down when it's growing on the tree, except it gets really heavy. For this example, I have an apple. That apple right there, that's the fruit that has the seeds in it that came from this flower, right? And that fruit is what we consume. Well, that fruit needs to be pollinated, right? The female part needs to get pollen. Pollen comes from a different plant or a different tree, and it doesn't get there without the coevolution relationship that we have with mutualism of bees and birds and bats in order to pollinate. Well, if we get collapse of beehives, which we're researching right now, that some of these bees are collapsing, their whole hives are collapsing, and we're losing entire colonies of bees. Pollination is not going to happen. Your fruits like the common apple that we see at the grocery store might be gone, or it might be so expensive that you and I can't consume it, right, for a reasonable cost. Other things that we need to think about is what's threatening this biodiversity, right? We know for a long time that humans are a big part of it. Whether it be destruction of the habitat, introduction of species, bringing them from one area to the other, like I was talking about with the symbiotic relationship destruction, or hunting, right? Hunting things to extinction. Now, we're usually better at this now, but it doesn't mean that we're the best at understanding population dynamics, and people that understand this more can do hunting in a reasonable fashion that is sustainable for the rest of the population of whatever organism that is being hunted. So these are things that we need to think about when we're talking about not only our poster projects, but also the big picture of what's going on here and what we're researching and what we're doing and why this is important not only for us, but for the sustainability of this planet.